was recently announced that the cost of importing vehicles could increase by as much as 20% in the coming weeks due to the 40% increase in the foreign exchange rate for clearing operations. In the light of this, the Nigerian government has announced 10-year tax relief for electric vehicle assemblers and manufacturers. Joining us to discuss this development is the Chief Operating Officer at AutoCheck Marketplace, Mayokun, Fadeyibi. Good afternoon and welcome to Newsday.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
So tell us, we know that dollars has gone up, pounds and other foreign exchange has gone up, and everything is going to, even the price of petrol has gone up, and there are few cars on the road. So in terms of how that has affected behavioral change in the marketplace for cars and other means of commuting, bring us up to speed. What does that really translate to? Because I'm sure a lot of people who are selling cars will begin to wonder whether people are coming to buy or not.
Yeah, I think the truth is mobility is the lifeblood of trade, right? So if you think about it, logistics, the lifeblood of international trade, and trade in itself then drives economic growth and activity. So in reality, cars are central to how we live and work. So all of these initiatives, right, would not only affect the economy, but also start to affect, have a ripple effect on the automotive industry. And in looking at all of these initiatives, you have the Forex, like you've talked about, subsidy removal, you have all of these headwinds, right? They have affected how the cost of owning, the cost of maintaining vehicles. But what is important to remember is simultaneously, we also have this tax relief initiatives that you've talked about. And it's not only about EVs. We have the 5-year tax relief as well for the combustion manufacturers and assemblers. So while we have these headwinds that are happening, which ultimately should lead us to a more stable economic environment, we also have the initiatives that are coming up alongside it. And I think it's important that we actually applaud the government for that, because we're building the foundation, right, ultimately to facilitate much more affordable vehicle ownership in country.
All right, Mayokun, I'm going to take you up on the issue of EV as well. About 2 years ago, I was at the launch of the Kona Electric. That was meant to revolutionize the way Nigerians think about electric cars and all that. But the question on people's lips then was that, okay, fine, what about infrastructure to to support that EV transformation? And of course, the governor then, Governor Sanwo-Olu, said, okay, fine, he was going to make sure infrastructure in terms of charging points were going to be put at several places. But, we're still looking at scenarios like that. Fine, you have a tax relief and all that. But how do you stimulate public acceptance of that, and do we actually think this is a viable alternative? Online recently, you find those converting their cars to gas.
CNG.
Yeah, ENG. We're seeing incidents whereby, overheated scenarios, the cars probably overheating, and probably the uncertainty of transforming those cars. When you have challenges like that, so how do you stimulate the public to, key in to that, whatever the government's intention, tax relief, and getting
education.
Education. Okay,
education is absolutely important.
All right.
You just talked about CNG. People will be wondering and thinking gas in my vehicles, but it's very different from the LPG gas that we're using in homes, right? So providing that education is also key. And then also the infrastructural development. You can decide to have EVs in countries, but charging points, access to power is also very important. And that's why I said you have to have symbiotic policies that are working together in place. One of the things that government has also done now is states can start to generate electricity. That wasn't there before, right? So by providing this as well, all of that can ultimately come together to actually ensure that not only are we able to have EVs in Nigeria, but you can also have the charging points, the power that's actually going to power these vehicles. And then you also have to think of the affordability of these vehicles. There you go,
stimulating the public to accept that.
Yeah, so you have to have credit. A lot of the times when we think about policies in the automotive ecosystem, we think about manufacturing. But we also have to look at all the other stakeholders within the value chain. from the dealers that are retailing those vehicles, to workshops that are maintaining those vehicles, to spare parts availability, to insurance. So one of the things that actually drives this is credit. Credit is the one thing that will catalyze that ecosystem and actually facilitate the ownership of vehicles. So at AutoCheck, we believe that access to affordable financing can actually help to drive this take-up, right, that you're talking about. If I could just kind of go through an example. If you think about 100 EVs manufactured, those 100 vehicles then get financed. So one, there's a dealer, right, that's able to benefit from the sale of these vehicles. Those vehicles are then financed. They then have insurance that goes on them. So now we've gone into the insurance industry, right? We've provided value there.
It's symbiosis, as you mentioned.
Exactly. You've gone into insurance.
Yeah.
Not just that, these vehicles are financed with an annual maintenance contract, where each of these vehicles should be maintained 4 times a year. That is 400 servicing schedules, right, that has now gone to the workshops. Beyond that, you have the spare parts, right, that is being used during this maintenance. And then those 100 vehicles now go through their life cycle of financing. They can then go back into the secondary market. To go back into the secondary market, they have to be inspected and graded and then refinanced. So essentially, you've gone through this life cycle and driven value across so many points within the value chain.
Okay, now my area of interest will always be when you have something like this. I like the idea. Anybody that has lived abroad would have seen how things have evolved over the years. And I look at this and listen to what my friend Nee just said, my colleague just said now. And what you're saying, the governor of Lagos State was interested some time ago, and the president of Nigeria is interested in moving Nigeria forward. Nigeria has been trying to move forward forever. When do you see us being in that position where common sense will prevail and we'll have electric vehicles all around the place? No charging point, no infrastructure, no nothing. The places where you will even be able to charge, even if you have it in your house, you're not sure that it's possible. When do you see it happening?
I think that we're being a bit cynical.
Help me.
The journey of 1,000 steps starts with at least one step.
Have we taken the first step?
We have.
Where? When?
With
How?
this policy. It's a first step, which means government is actually paying attention to it.
So maybe 1,000 years we'll get there eventually.
Not 1,000 years.
We can't play catch up.
1,000 years.
Not 1,000 years,
1,000
definitely.
years. We're taking the first step.
We're taking the first step.
We take one step.
We're taking the first step
In
with
another
this
4
policy.
years, we'll take a second step.
Then also this government has also been very vocal about financing, about credit, right? By layering that on, again, that stimulates, right? And we start to leapfrog the effects. Simultaneously, power is also seeing its own initiatives. So for me, it's not 1,000 years. I think
maybe 500.
No, definitely not 500 years either.
100
because
years.
the world is changing.
Okay.
And I was actually thinking about that this morning, that the fact that government is even doing this means we would not be left behind. Because in Europe, in the developed world, it is starting to happen, right? We can't afford to wait 10 more years, 20 more years, and that's when the policies start to come into place. The policies have to come in, get the private sector in, because it's those policies that actually drive.
Is the policy across board, across the nation, or just in some parts of the country?
The policy is across board,
Okay, so you have the policy across board. The next step should be electricity and infrastructure. Where do you see this happening? The federal government is not going to start providing infrastructure in states. So it's got to be owned, domesticated by the state governors.
Yes.
Which of the states do you see championing this kind of thing?
Like you mentioned, the governor of Lagos State has started to champion that with electricity. I think recently the governor of Ogun State also starts to champion electric vehicles, CNG. So we're seeing it move around, essentially. So governors are owning it. They're also now having the ability to generate their own electricity, which means they can actually facilitate it even within states And to your point, it's not even just about the governors. It's also about creating that ecosystem that allows for private sector participation.
Very good, Mayokun. And obviously with this zero subsidy regime, there's this tendency to think outside of the box, especially when it comes to automotive scenarios. So with all this gamut of these events, as we've highlighted, so how is it affecting car buying behavior, and have you noticed any significant changes so far, regarding all of these issues, you think?
So I think typically in terms of car buying behavior, you don't usually see huge changes, right? I wouldn't say there's been a significant change. Typically within Nigeria, there has been demand more for foreign used vehicles versus brand new vehicles. That's just the way.
In fact, you just spoke my mind at the moment, So go ahead.
So that is still in place. But I would say that people now start to think towards more affordability, right? You start to consider things like brands, makes and models. What would you, even from a maintenance, the ability to maintain the vehicle, the spare parts availability. You start to think also around the resale value of those vehicles in itself. So in terms of overall nature of demand, it's still quite stable, but again, you just start to think more from an affordability perspective.
Okay, so in terms of that infrastructure that is required being there, what kind of timeline? And a lot of Nigerians are very hopeful, especially with the situation with petrol prices. So the expectation is, if it is possible for me to completely forget about guzzling petrol, and I can charge my car. The infrastructure is available. You drive from here to Abeokuta. You're not going to be in a situation where you get to the hotel and they say, no, we don't have charging points. So abandon your car in Abeokuta and go by foot.
Funny enough, Kayode, even in the the Western climes where all this infrastructure is on ground, they still have shortages of charging points. I've noticed that. I've had to read through some scenarios like that, and you start wondering, someone who has an EV, he's thinking, okay, fine, if I don't get charged up at this point, the next one, and I'm going on cross-country, travel, and there's that niggling concern that I might not be able to charge my EV.
In some places.
Which is why I've said that I think that we're being very critical of us.
No, 500.
It's not 500.
100 years.
Well, we need to walk the walk, when you talk the talk, just implement something and let people see what's on ground.
Yes, exactly.
But the behavior is there, the interest is there.
The interest is there, the behavior is there, the initiatives are there, and I believe we're going to get there sooner rather than later. Much sooner rather than later.
We hope so. But in terms of money then, one of the most difficult part of this whole issue is the money side of it. When people want interest-free for EV, it's not going to happen. If you want a single-digit interest loan to be able to acquire a vehicle like that, there should be interest. Who's going to push that initiative to government to give support to encouragement of people to acquire an electric vehicle by making sure there is a single-digit interest loan for vehicles like that? Who's going to do it?
Government. Government has to create that enabling environment, right, for the single-digit interest rates. There even single-digit interest rate, if you think about it, there's inflation in Nigeria, but there's inflation worldwide.
Yes.
And it has affected interest rates everywhere, globally, right? Countries, the Federation, the interest rates just keep increasing at the moment, right? So in reality, I would say that looking at single digits might not be the immediate answer, but it would be how can we actually reduce it as much as possible? What are the things that we can do from an economic perspective to ensure that we can then facilitate these lower and reduced interest? Because what we have seen over the last, I would say, 1 year, is interest rates are continuously increasing, and banks are having to respond to MPR being increased. So in reality, banks can't do anything about it. They have to rely on the government. to
Indeed.
ensure that we can get this.
Indeed. All of this is still an evolving and a fluid scenario. Hopefully, we'll get more optimism as time goes on. Mayokun, Fadeyibi.
Yes,
CEO,
Fadeyibi.
Auto Check
Is
Marketplace.
it Fadeyibi or Fadeyibi?
It's Fadeyibi. It's
Fadeyibi.
a very common mistake. It's Fadeyibi.
All right, CEO, Auto Check, would like to Marketplace. Would like to thank you for joining us on Newsdays. Good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.